Hi there, and welcome to Book-ramble. Puckoon. This one is bonkers, and deliberately so. This is Spike Milligan, who has a certain turn of phrase and humour. He was well known for it. I think he took up Irish citizenship. He was fascinated with Ireland. He was born in India, I think. And after the war, he wrote about, eventually, his role in the war in North Africa. He became a writer and started the Goons. And from there, did this kind of trek of surreal type humour. Amazing. I've done a couple of things already about the book and the way in which the author just interjects himself as a character into the book. And that happens 2 or 3 times, and especially at the end. So where do I begin? I think the best thing to start off with is Spike admitted that this was his first and last novel. He really struggled with it. This is the foreword. This damn book nearly drove me mad. I started it in 1958, doodled with it for 4 years. I don't think I could go through it all again. And he doubted whether people would enjoy it or even find it of interest. It's the only book in my memory in which, when I read it in the 80s, and I've forgotten nearly all of it, it was the only book that I laughed out loud. I said that before. Didn't this time. Obviously times moved on, sensibilities have changed, perhaps my humour has changed. But it is amusing. And it's effectively, and he draws a couple of characters, really grotesque type characters. Not all of them. Puckoon is a small sleepy village, and it's the 1920s after the First World War. And we've had in the background this real conflict where, leading into the war, the whole of the island of Ireland was British. But the southern part fought for independence, the Irish Republican Army, IRA, and they're mentioned a few times. So it's really quite a difficult time. It's also a time of extreme poverty. Several and a half metric miles northeast of Sligo, the microcephalic community of Puckoon. The closer to the village you get, the more grotesque they are. In appearance, let alone their background. There are characters we're introduced to that originate further afield, and they're painted not so grotesquely, but they're still damn. They are eccentric. Now, I've made a note here, this use of obscure words, very unusual words, in the text, and I need to find you an example. The sun was warm again, he stretched out on a gently sloping gravestone. A breeze turned the trees into a rataplan of skirling leaves. Rataplan? Never come across it. And that happens a few times in the book. And throughout the book, what we're introduced to are comedic scenes, and often they're threaded together a bit haphazard. Mainly they work. There's 1 or 2 that I still don't understand why we're there, apart from, I think, the author wanted to put them in. There's a rolling couple at one point, with a reference to D.H. Lawrence. Okay, they're introduced, but why? It's just for some effect. We don't ever come across them again. But Milligan has this beautiful turn of phrase. And in many ways, I think I wouldn't be surprised if he was fascinated by the Irish idioms and the way in which sentences are put together. It's just nothing like it on earth. My family is originally from Ireland, from a place called Killishandra. And I remember visiting a friend's family in Athlone on the Shannon. We were sat in the lounge on the sofas. His mother came in and asked us to move, and she was lifting up the cushions and going back and forth. And I said, "Have you lost anything?" And she said, "I don't know. I'll tell you when I find it." Brilliant. But here's an example of language as written by Spike. It's on page 17. The greenaceous daisy-spattled field spread out before Milligan. He's one of the characters, but not the main character. The bayonets of grass shining bravely in the sun. Above him the sky was an exultation of larks. Slowfully, Milligan pedalled on his way. Great billy bollers of perspiration were running down his knees, nose and neck. And the knees is spelt with a K, the nose is spelt with a K, and the neck is spelt with a K. Amazing. He also intercedes quite a few what I would consider to be truisms. That's not necessarily linked just to the world in which he's painting, the remote Ireland of the 1920s. So one of the characters I've just introduced to you is Milligan. And he has a flashback to the time was in the war, First World War. And he was a coward. Gunner Milligan, this is a battery major who had to investigate why he ran away. You have been acting like a coward. No, sir, and I'm not going to do the Irish accent. No, sir. No, not true. I'm a hero with coward's legs. I'm a hero from the waist up. Silence! Why did you leave your post? Well, it had woodworm in it, sir. The roof of the trench was falling in. Silence! You acted like a coward. I wasn't acting, sir. I could have you shot. Shot? Why didn't they shoot me in peacetime? I was still the same coward. Men like you are a waste of time in war. Understand? Oh? Well then, men like you are a waste of time in peace. And of course, he was in World War II. And I have to agree with him. I wasn't in war, but I was in the Navy, and a lot of people who do well in the military, yeah, okay, there's a different world, different kind of discipline. Overly harsh at times. In fact, there's a great book about World War One that I definitely want to do. And it's about a Kiwi who didn't want to go. He was a conscientious objector. I think his name was Baxter. He wouldn't do what the authorities wanted him to. They literally forced him on a ship, and he had to go all the way to France via South Africa. And when he was there, because he refused to follow orders, they gave him the #1 field punishment, which effectively is crucifixion without the nails. He had to literally hang like this in an open field that was being shelled. Just appalling abuse of power. And this is what Milligan's talking about. There's also a great amount of wit, because this is Milligan. Well, he thought, you can fool some of the people all the time, and all the people some of the time, which is just long enough to be President of the United States. And bear in mind, this was written in the 1950s. So what we get is, really, it's like a comedy of errors. The scenes thread together. They're often implausible, often verging on the ridiculous. There's one scene where it's been really hot and then it breaks the weather. There's a thunderstorm, and the Milligan, he's often known as the Milligan, on a bike, he suddenly comes at the end of a scene into a pub and is all blackened because he's been hit by lightning. It's those kind of things. It's ribald, it's knockabout, it's almost like a pantomime. And why is it happening? It's because when Ireland, Southern Ireland, became Éire, the Republic of Éire, a border, which now is the border between Ulster and Ireland, had to be formed. And there's this wonderful scene where the people doing it can't be bothered, it's getting late, they want to go to the pub, and they just randomly all put their hands on a pen, do it, do it, do it. So there's the border, which when you go down happens to run through Puckoon, this sleepy non-entity village where we've been introduced to these characters. And it literally cuts through a churchyard. And that's the basis of the background. What it means is that in the churchyard, suddenly, people that have been already interned in graves are on the other side of the border. And people who want to be buried, because there's only a bit of space left, they have to get passports and photographs so they can take the coffin across the border to be interred and so on. Just a great background farcical event. There is one thing that I picked up, and it almost jarred, and I can't get my head around it even now. So we've been told that World War One has happened and people have been involved, and it's the 1920s. Then what Spike tends to do, he introduces characters and then gives a bit of a background to them, which you assume is in the past. But we're introduced to one person, Goldstein he's called, talking about his father, and then suddenly he mentions a white Burgundy 1937. And it's like, hang on, how is that possible? There's a uncertain shifting of time here. I don't know if it was a printing error or an editing error. I'm not too sure. But it's like it jars and it's thinking, what era are we in? You could read a lot into that. It may have been deliberate, but I don't know. He often interjects certain thoughts that really is about the time and place in which he was writing in the 1950s and 60s. One of the characters is Father Rudden, who is a priest, and he is the priest of that church in which the border runs through the graveyard. And they're having this drink, getting a bit sloshed, and they're talking about getting more people to the church, higher attendance, in other words, numbers. And this is Milligan. He says, "I say that Roman Catholicism is losing ground." "Ha ha," said the priest. "Losing ground? With 500 million at the last count." O'Brien, a character, rubbed his chin. "That's the trouble. It's like commercial television. Never mind what kind of audience you got as long as you got plenty of them. The world is only concerned with numbers, not quality. It's a biological fact that you can't have numbers and quality. All things that continue in numbers run to seed. If not to seed, they become a commune of non-thinkers like ants or bees." I just kept thinking of YouTube and TV and films. There's always the push to the big numbers, but is there a cost? I'll let you decide on that. Everything builds up, all these threads towards the end, and it's actually very well done, but it's like a modern farce movie. They get into a big house. There is constructed on a pool a wooden kind of deck on which a small troupe of musicians are playing, a quartet or a quintet. And it's part of a scout jamboree. Every year they come in and do a performance. And things happen, and the fire brigade are called, and it's just it's a bit like Keystone Cops from the 1920s. There's this madcap chase, and involves a horse, a frightened horse, a cart, a panther, a Chinese man who happens to be in the Irish constabulary with an inappropriate name, and it just builds to this crescendo of stupidity and farce. And right at the end, the character, the Milligan, happens to have got dressed up as Julius Caesar and with a hat, and he's stuck in a tree. And we already know that the fourth wall has been broken because Milligan has this conversation continually with the author, and he has a code word to shout out if he gets into trouble, and he does. He's up in the tree, and this is years after everything's happened. He's still stuck in that tree. Can't get down, and he says to the author, "You can't leave me like this." And the last words are, Spike Milligan said, "Oh, can't I?" And the book ends. I'm glad I reread it. There's some wonderful characterization and the flow of the story. I really enjoy Spike Milligan's madcap humour, but it's not for everyone. I could imagine this is going to leave a lot of people cold. It's just too daft. And the characterizations are way over the top. But it's Spike Milligan. He's done his own little artwork pieces. There's these set scenes he's obviously threaded together. And generally, it's a good romp, and it's a good, read over a day or two. Took me about 2 weeks. And I think that if you are a Spike Milligan fan and you want to keep his other books about his time in the army, I think Adolf Hitler, My Part in His Downfall. That's a great book. I remember it as being great, but then I remember Puckoon being great. So I will reread that one. It's a very good book to consider. But this is in the side of bookery that is the farcical side. And there's a lot of books like it. And they've got a sense of looking at the world, which I find quite refreshing. It points fun at the madcap and the buffoonery. For instance, that conversation about Milligan being a coward. There's a lot of truisms he brings in. The politics, the idiocy of people in charge. That's what it is. Milligan, throughout his books, paints a picture, I think, of a man, an ordinary man, who has to stand up against the lunocracy, the lunacy of bureaucracy of, well, in this case, the British Empire when he was alive, and then the Commonwealth, and people in charge, and their characters, and they've got these foibles that they hide, and he just paints this picture of, especially of Ireland, of the people, and how, compared to the more mundane, know your place British, is very different. And I think it's great just for that. In fact, just as a preview here, I got this. It's about the pirates of old. Francis Drake it begins with. But there's this Irish woman, Grace O'Malley. She probably was known as Grania. And she was Irish, obviously, and had to go to the Queen, Queen Elizabeth I, to answer certain questions. And a lot of it was the English not really fully understanding the Irish, and the Irish being of a culture that had taken on the English language, but it's not their necessarily native language, and then having to deal with the authorities that didn't really understand the Irish way of life. And then the Irish having to cope with that. I once knew an actor who was Irish. I went to see him perform on a London stage. Afterwards, turned up at the pub. He just walked in like a typical actor. I am here. And the crowd was quite big, and they turned around and, yeah, hello. I don't think he bought one drink. And I got talking to him, and he said a profound thing. I speak in English, but I dream in Irish. Very, very interesting. So Puckoon is really about the English authorities, the British authorities, I should say, imposing through this border a Britishness that the people who lived there had to deal with. And, of course, it went straight through their little town. There's a place in Vermont that's on the border with Canada, and the border runs straight down the street. In fact, I went on Google Maps to follow it. The road goes that way north, and there's like a where you have to go through the customs, and it's kind of barricaded. And you have to go through that way. So these things happen, border towns, and Puckoon unknowingly becomes it. So it is an interesting read. I do recommend it. It's joyful, it's madcap, it's ridiculous. Take it what it is. So Puckoon. Ta-ta for now.